Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, as the case may be, and welcome to this edition of the Peace Science Society Online Peace Science Colloquium, where we take a chance every couple of weeks to have authors, whether typically assistant professors or graduate students or postdocs, as the case may be, to present ongoing cutting-edge research in the field of peace science. This week we have a paper by Crisman-Cox, who is at Washington University in St. Louis. He'll present a paper called Civil Wars of Attrition. And our panelists are myself, Scott Wolford at the University of Texas, Ben Jones at Ole Miss, Jackie Sievert at Bowling Green, who is pulling an Axl Rose and not showing up yet, and Jonathan Renshon at Wisconsin. So what we'll do, Casey, is have you give us about a 15-minute presentation before we open the floor up to discussion. We'll try to go for about an hour, wrap things up at around that time, at which point we'll give you a chance to respond at the end. So without further ado, Casey, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Scott, and thanks to everyone for listening in and providing feedback. As you said, my paper is titled Civil Wars of Attrition. It's about bargaining and reputation. And the basic question where this starts is how really does reputation, specifically this idea of reputation for resolve, lengthen or shorten conflict? And in addition to that, I'm interested in sort of what determines these reputations. And so what I'm doing here is is coming up with a way to estimate each side in a civil war's reputation for resolve at the beginning of the conflict, and then seeing how that affects both conflict duration and outcomes. And so the main results that are going to come out of this is this idea that sort of wars are longest when actors have sort of near even reputations. Is also going to find that government reputation is going to be is going to matter a lot more in predicting who wins conflicts, whereas rebel reputation really has no strong effect there. And finally, I'm going to have this result then that democracies sort of have a fundamental disadvantage when it comes to reputation. So before going on, it's worth sort of defining what we mean by reputation in this case. And in particular, we're going to focus on this idea of reputation for resolve, which is just going to refer to an actor's belief about its opponent, about whether or not it's willing to back down or concede in a conflict. And so in this context, then, is going to mean this idea that rebels are going to have some beliefs about whether or not governments are willing to negotiate with them, and that's going to be the government's reputation, and vice versa for rebel reputation. And the sort of main contributions of this endeavor are going to be this idea that we can sort of actually talk about this theoretical concept of reputation and put some actual kind of estimates on what these things look like. And we're going to be able to sort of analyze how this affects both duration and outcome of specific conflicts. And we're able to do this by taking a formal model of bargaining and reputation and fitting that directly to data. And this is going to be sort of, as far as I can tell, the first real attempt to sort of fit these explicit attrition dynamics that people in conflict research like to talk about increasingly often to Civil War data. And so the basic setup of the model is going to come from a 2000 paper, and it's just going to be sort of simplified so we can talk about reputation in an easy way. And so we're going to have two actors in this case, government and a rebel group, bargaining over some good of size 1. And at the beginning, nature is going to assign each actor to be one of two types, either a strategic type, making sort of standard expected utility calculations, or an intransigent type. And that intransigent type is going to be identified by some amount of the good, which we're going to call alpha bar, that they always demand and never accept less than. And reputation in this case is going to be this belief that one actor has that its opponent is this intransigent type that will never surrender or never negotiate or never accept less than a certain division of the good. And so in this bargaining setup, then time is going to be continuous with at each instant, everyone is either making a demand or conceding. And intransigent types will only accept a demand if they get at least their intransigent offer, alpha bar, and otherwise they just continue to fight. And strategic types are going to be mimicking this intransigent type. So at each point, actors are either making an intransigent offer or they reveal that they are in fact strategic, and that's going to end the conflict. And so the game ends when somebody concedes, and when that happens, excuse me, when that happens, the actor who concedes gets 1 minus its opponent's intransigent demand, just discounted by its own discount rate there in continuous time for however long it took the conflict to end, and the winner gets its intransigent demand. And a strategy in this framework then is just going to be a distribution function over possible quitting time. So Fi is going to denote the probability that player I has exited the conflict at time t or sooner. So with this sort of basic setup, then it's worth sort of asking what conflict actually looks like. And in particular, in this setup, conflict is going to be this sort of series of what are effectively non-serious offers. And this is going to create this kind of war of attrition dynamic, where conflict continues because one or both actors are actually intransigent and won't exit, or they want to build this reputation by feigning intransigence in order to sort of mimic this high resolve type in order to get its intransigent demand at the end. And the result then is going to allow us to fit this to data is going to be what what these strategies actually look like. So as in sort of all wars of attrition with incomplete information like this, there's only going to be one player who considers giving up at the initial period or at the start of the game, and we're going to refer to this as sort of either with the subscript 1, or we're going to refer to him as a weaker player because he's the only one who considers conceding right away. And it's going to turn out that in equilibrium, we can identify the weaker player just based on this combination of lambda, which is the hazard at which the players give up, their hazard rate, and their reputation, which is the z parameter. And the result from a brew and goal is going to be that in this continuous time bargaining game, there's going to be a unique equilibrium where the strategies are going to look like how they're presented there, where one player is conceding at this sort of exponential rate, and the other player is just a slightly modified exponential. And so what we can do with this setup then is we can start talking or thinking about how we might use data to back out what these z's are, because that's kind of the parameter of major interest to us. So the first thing we're going to do is just put a real simple reduced form expression on the hazard rates, sort of a standard x beta there, and more or less just to have something on that, and so we can then turn our attention to the z parameters. What is going to make this endeavor tricky, though, is going to be this idea that we need to determine for each conflict which player is the sort of weaker actor. And we're going to let the data decide that. So for each particular civil conflict and each guess of the parameters, we're going to have an indicator for whether or not the rebels are weak under those parameters or the government is weak under those parameters. And that's going to sort of allow the model to sort of speak to which conflicts have these character which actor is which within each conflict without sort of imposing that from above. The other empirical challenge then is that every observation is of course censored in some way. We only see the endurance decisions of the loser, whomever actually concedes, whereas winners are censored. And of course, in ongoing conflicts, both sides' willingness to continue is also censored. So with all those challenges in mind, we can start thinking about what the likelihood function would actually look like if the data is generated from the game that I'm considering. And so just to sort of think about this step by step, we can think about these first two cases where rebel groups win the conflicts. In this case, the first term in here is that this idea that there's some chance that the rebels are strategic, 1 minus ZR, and if they are, then winning the conflict means that they lasted at least this long and could have gone longer. So we get this censored, just 1 minus the strategy of lasting that long or longer. And then the balance of probability is that they were in fact intransigent, and the probability of making it that far is 1 for intransigent types. The second 2 cases then are going to be where rebel groups lose. In this case, the probability that they're strategic times the density for exiting at that time, sort of standard kind of duration modeling. And then finally, that they're in fact this weak actor who puts positive probability on exiting the conflict, and their duration in this case is just given as that probability of that they actually exited at time 0. And then just switching all the subscripts, we can get the same, where the overall likelihood, log likelihood, then is just this combination of government and rebels. And what we can do with then is take this estimator and apply it to sort of standard Civil War data. In particular, the UCDP termination data set records civil conflicts at the conflict episode level, as well as the outcomes of each conflict. So we can say which side granted concessions and sort of revealed their type. And duration then is just going to be measured in months here, with this idea of exiting at the initial period, meaning a conflict in this case is going to start and end within the same month. And we're just going to take that to mean that the conflict starts and somebody's immediately realized that this is not something they wanted to do, and decides to drop out right away. And we're just going to throw in sort of a whole host of sort of standard Civil War controls to parameterize the lambdas, because, as we said before, this is not sort of the main parameter of interest for this project. We're more focused on these reputation parameters. And so the first thing that we're going to focus on then in the results is going to be this comparison between just a single constant for all rebels and all governments. And this allows us to sort of just initially focus on this idea of what do reputations actually look like in civil conflicts. And the first thing that we can just observe from this real basic constant only approach is that governments have sort of substantially larger reputations going into conflicts than rebel groups do. And this sort of reflects reasonable expectations in that governments have sort of much more time to build these reputations going into conflicts. They're longer lived. They have more resources to put into building this going into conflict. And overall, this sort of provides, I think, a very nice kind of face validity to this endeavor. It's just that this gap exists. So what we might be interested in then is sort of how we would expect conflict duration to change as these reputation parameters change. And so what we sort of see is that we get this kind of quadratic-ish effect, single peaked effect, that's probably more accurate to say, throughout this range, where it sort of crests along these near when reputations are near parity. And to make this a little easier to look at, we can focus on a couple specific spots. So in this case, each line here is fixing the rebel reputation. So the low is going to be sort of near 0, the low end of the confidence interval in the parameter. The green line is where the estimated value of the rebel reputation is, and then the high line is going to be this sort of high end of the confidence interval. So moving roughly from near 0 to about 0.2, whereas we're also just moving the government reputation pretty much in areas where we would expect to find it based on the point estimate. And what we can sort of see is that we get this result where when there is this sort of one-sided reputational advantage, the actor who has it is privileged by it, and that once again fits with sort of standard expectations. And perhaps more interesting is this idea of how these parameters affect the outcomes of conflicts. So in particular, this is I think a result that is sort of unexpected just from looking at the initial model, which is just that there was sort of nothing in the theoretical model forcing this to be true, but we still uncover this result that government reputation is going to be sort of fundamentally a major determinant in terms of how these conflicts end. And the chances of a rebel victory sort of matter very little in terms of how governments are viewing rebels, but whether or not the government has sort of a strong reputation going into conflict is going to be very influential here. And just to put that in more perspective, we can look at the same kind of cutaways of that plot, and in particular, we can see that we get these very stark changes as we vary ZG, but changing the rebel reputation only results in sort of very small changes as we shift from line to line here. And this is kind of interesting in the sense that even in cases where the government and the rebels both have a low reputation, governments sort of acknowledge that they're more disadvantaged by this and are willing to concede in these instances. And so the last set of results here is going to be this idea of expanding these reputations to include some country and conflict specific effects. And in particular, we might be interested in sort of this idea of how democracy measured with standard polity scores and state power with a kind of a standard GDP per capita as a proxy there. And in particular, the major takeaway here is going to be that democracy has this effect of increasing or benefiting rebel reputation while simultaneously decreasing the governments. So democracies are sort of disadvantaged on two fronts in that the rebel groups that are emerging here have stronger reputations going into conflict, and while their own reputations are very much lower than they would be in their autocratic counterparts. The other and interesting effect then is that we get with state power is that we get the sort of obvious effects that it increases the government's reputation, more power, better standing going into conflict, whereas it's going to hurt the rebel reputation for very sort of intuitive reasons. However, the interesting effect here is that it has sort of a much larger effect on the rebel reputation, moving it much closer to zero as state power increases. So just to wrap up, the things that that I did in this paper are introduced a new approach to think about Civil War duration by directly fitting a model that includes these kind of attrition dynamics that have become increasingly common for explaining civil conflict. And that's allowed us to talk about how these beliefs, which we used as a measure for reputation, affect both conflict duration and outcomes, and we can begin to think about sort of what sorts of things go into determining actors' reputations going into conflicts. And the results are largely going to be that both sides have reasonably strong reputations, but governments have this reputational advantage on average. The concession, whether or not rebels sort of are able to be victorious in conflict, are going to depend very heavily on how rebels view the government and not vice versa. And finally, this idea that democracies have this sort of double disadvantage where rebel groups have a stronger reputation in these conflicts, while the government is sort of weakened by their democracy here. And just moving forward, some future work that I see this going is I want to sort of continue and expand this focus on the determinants reputation, because this seems to be sort of, I think, a more interesting question going forward, and one that is very hard to study directly without some kind of structural approach like the one in this paper. And some other things that we can think about are how this might apply to interstate war. That might be an interesting project going forward. Particularly see how these reputations vary for major powers or initiators or things like that. And finally, just my general research agenda focuses on these kinds of structural models of both civil and interstate conflict. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to receiving your comments and feedback. Yeah, I guess I'll turn it back over.
Okay. Thank you. That was nearly perfectly timed. I have to say I didn't have to do a warning or anything, and as a guest host, That's excellent. But at this point, it's time to welcome Jackie for getting the technical difficulties resolved, and we will open up the queue. So if you're ready to speak, put that finger up and we will get going. Okay, Jonathan, you're first. I would say go ahead.
All right, thank you. That was a great presentation. This was a fun paper for me to read, partly because I have been working on a bunch of stuff about reputation, obviously from a very different perspective. By the way, you guys can hear me. I'm not accidentally muted. Okay, not okay. All right, awesome. So I just want to talk a little bit about the framing in ways that I think could sort of improve it even more. So the first paragraph was a little bit confusing to me, and maybe this just needs some clarification, but it sets up this particular problem, which is a very real problem of reputations are inherently not directly observable in the way we typically think about this kind of thing. And then in the next couple sentences, you talk about addressing it by developing this new estimator. But I'm not sure the way you've set up the problem. It's unclear to me how the new estimator fixes the problem of reputations being sort of fundamentally something that's difficult to observe directly. More broadly, I had a suggestion. I wanted maybe the group can tell me if this makes sense. One of the things we do in the experimental literature on reputation is we sort of delight in talking about how much of an improvement experiments are over like formal modeling and observational data. And we point out all the inferential problems, and we always like set it up as like, we're finally actually measuring real beliefs, or we're, you know. So I wonder if you guys could turn that around a little bit. So there are a lot of studies on reputation, and experiments on them have become more popular, but I would not be surprised to hear that there are things that are like largely missing from those that you do get from this other approach. And I wonder if it's not like leaving money on the table to not address those head on and say like, look, there's this like dozens of new papers on experiments on reputation. That's great for some things, but for what I'm interested in, for this interesting theoretical problem, we have to go back to modeling these, laying out these assumptions more clearly and fitting it to real world data, which is something that's largely absent from experimental stuff. So I wonder if like addressing those trade-offs just straight on and convincing people that this is like a really good, I think that might broaden the appeal a little bit and make it a little bit of a bigger paper on reputation. That's it for now. I'll shut up.
Okay, just to check, Peter, the man behind the curtain, do we allow a response before a two-finger, or do we just jump straight to the two-finger?
Let's jump straight to the two-finger.
Okay, Jackie, you're up.
Okay. My framing question is a little bit similar to Jonathan's, which is, I'm not sure what your puzzle is here. I think what you're doing is really interesting, and you have some really novel results that come through at the end. But in terms of the setup, I'm not sure what is the unexplained phenomenon that exists that you are contributing to here. Is it that we observe rebels with these mutations and we're not modeling these? Is it that we don't have a satisfying explanation for wars of attrition? I'm not sure what the hook is, and I worry one of the problems is you might, by jumping kind of right into the model, is that you're going to lose people that otherwise I think will find your work really valuable. So, what is the unexplained phenomenon that we have here that you are providing a new or a better explanation to?
Just building on that, I had sort of a similar feeling that the puzzle was missing, and I have a suggestion to sort of potentially push you in that right direction. One of the things I thought was really great about the paper is the inclusion of the examples of Peru and Angola, where you have, in the Angolan case, it's sort of intransigent leader who's never going to agree to peace. And then when you actually get around to parameterizing the beliefs at the end of the paper, you sort of treat it as this like, oh, I just did it, I don't care. I think that's a really great contribution that you can potentially frame the paper around, right? What you're doing in this is not just an exercise in formal modeling. You're giving us a way to actually get real world estimates of the beliefs of resolve of both governments and rebel organizations in civil wars in a way that we just haven't had before, right? We always sort of, proxy these things using weird variables that aren't all that compelling. You're giving us a compelling, theoretically derived way to get at that. And I think that's at least one potentially cool hook that you can use at the start of the paper to draw in a broader audience of Civil War scholars who maybe have less at stake in the formal modeling side.
Okay, cool. And I think we have one more two-finger, John, before we allow our response.
Yeah, so on those 2 points, I think they're really good. I'm not sure that, so in trying to put together Ben and Jacqueline's points, I do think it still needs like a better hook. I think either way, whatever that hook is, it does seem to me that one thing that you could do to make this a bigger, so it depends. Like in some ways, you could see the paper going in a bunch of directions. So it could be in a sort of a more formally oriented journal, and its appeal would be quite obvious to people who do this kind of work. I think a challenge and something that is an option open to you is making it a bigger paper about reputation. To do that, and I'm sort of like the token non-formal modeler here, or I feel like one, you have to be super upfront about what exactly is going on. Like, how are you identifying beliefs in this? That seems puzzling to people who don't do this kind of work. Explain right up front, like I developed this way of doing research that allows you to identify these beliefs based on the fit between this model and the data, and that's really novel, and it will preempt a lot of questions, but you just have to be like way more upfront about exactly how you're doing that stuff, because it's actually really interesting.
Okay, Casey, would you like some time to respond?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that these are all really great comments. And the first thing I want to say is to Ben, which is, I think that that's absolutely right. Unfortunately, the paper as it's written now very much has this kind of timeline feel to it, where it's you can very much see like how the pitch has evolved in terms of like where I've gone is all at the end. But and that's not a good way to write a paper, obviously. But that's sort of how it's currently cobbled together. But I think that sort of the determinants aspect that's tagged at the end right now is very much where I want to take this going forward, in terms of maybe reframing a lot of the upfront stuff to better reflect that. And sort of the idea of sort of what the motive is for all of this is of course a very important question, and sort of the way that I sort of conceptualize this is this idea that we really like talking about reputation as this sort of theoretical concept, but and we can write down all sorts of models that have reputation in them, and talk about sort of how that affects different things. But in this approach then is designed to give us a way to sort of see which things actually go into reputation. And maybe that's not so much a puzzle so much as just it would be nice to be able to talk about reputation and say, well, these things actually are associated with it, or not, as the case may be. And in that sense, I probably do need to engage more with the experimental stuff, at least, to be able to say, these people have found these associations with reputation, and I can either say that that's reasonable or not based on a model that is designed to back out reputation has from real world observed conflicts. Turn it back over.
Okay, so I have a similar question, and I debated whether to put this as a two-finger or not. But coming in from the modeling side, when I read this paper, I kept wondering if it was about reputation at all, right? Only in the sense that I think it's about something broader. And part of this might be my issues with the Abreu and Gould paper, and not so much yours, because in their story, and when it comes through in your model, they just have a player who is exogenously unwilling to ever settle, right? Which is fine. And you could imagine that they might be unwilling to do that because there are reputational benefits in doing so, but they're not in the game, right? So they basically say, if you care about your reputation, then you're just going to be this type that really never that really never concedes, and then other people will try to act like that as well. But it doesn't really treat that, frequently when we think about reputation, it's about how, today's behavior is connected to behavior in a different context or a different event tomorrow, something like that. And that's really not here directly, which again is fun, but I kept thinking, well, this could be reputation, it may not be, but it's really, what I found most interesting about it was that it's a nice application showing that private information can explain lengthy conflicts, right? Which, we had this idea ever since this Powell paper in '06 and this Fearon paper in '04 that, uncertainty can't really explain long conflicts, which seems a bit quick to claim, right? And what I saw here was almost like an empirical application of the Whitman paper from AJPS in '09, where he looks at two-sided incomplete information and its effect on the outbreak of war. And I actually read it that way simply because the quantity over which we're uncertain here could be your reputational incentives to fight because there are other rebel groups looming. It really could just be an uncertainty over the government's willingness to settle, right? So it's the model itself is a general private information model. And so I don't know that you have to hang it entirely on reputation, right? And then the other reason that stuck with me, and I don't have a good solution to this, is that, this type that doesn't like to settle is intransigent. But we can imagine that the reason you might be intransigent in a civil war is that there's an underlying commitment problem, right? Where settlement means giving up a certain level of power and the potential to be victimized, which makes us not think so much about reputation, right? So I think you do have a decision to make. Whether is this a reputation paper and how do you make it clearly so, or is it really just a solution to the problem of the link between uncertainty and lengthy conflicts? I found that more compelling, right? And but again, that's my biases. But I think it might be worth thinking about whether it needs to be so heavily pinned towards reputation, because again, this is reputation within a specific conflict, right? Which, that makes sense, but there's always incentives to misrepresent your preferences when you're involved in a conflict. They may not be reputational, so.
I mean, yeah, I think that's absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. Specifically, this idea of private information and conflict is. I think that, yeah, because you're this idea that private information used to whenever we talked about it, we used to just talk about like private information over capabilities or something, but this is private information over something else, which is this ability, your willingness to negotiate, and that is sort of nice in the sense that you're right. This is a private information story for war that can explain lengthy conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth about whether or not is intransigence really reputation or not. I don't really know. I like it because I think it really lines up with sort of like the Defoe and definitions,
Mm-hmm.
at least in my mind. Maybe John can weigh in on that better than I can. But yeah, I like it because it's a nice one-word way to talk about a concept here.
Okay, I think Ben, we had a two-finger.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I do like that idea of sort of pitching this as more of an information story, and I think to build on what Scott was saying, right? When we're thinking about information and uncertainty about capabilities, it's pretty clear how you would reveal that information through fighting on the battlefield. With respect to intransigence, it's not clear how that gets revealed, and this relates to just it was a relatively minor thing, but briefly in the paper you mentioned that there's updating of beliefs through a Bayesian process regarding the other person's reputation. And I just, I don't know if you want to address it now or just want to clean it up in the paper. It wasn't immediately clear to me how those beliefs were being updated, right? Based on what previous information are people forming new beliefs about their opponent's reputation for intransigence?
Kidding. Jonathan, we have a two finger. Oh, you want to unmute?
There we go. On the last 2 points, so one of the things that seems like it comes out of all of these comments is that and I sort of had this intuition when I was reading the papers that it does a lot right now. There's a lot of stuff going on. We haven't even talked about the framing of it as being sort of about the two side, like estimating based on two sides' beliefs, and sort of relative beliefs about the other side's willingness to fight, which is also something that's on pretty strong in the paper and fascinating to me. But one of the things that I think, no matter what you choose, it seems like you sort of have to narrow it down a little bit, because the paper can only do so much without it causes too many problems when you have these like ancillary things that you also are innovating on or doing something different, because then people want to talk about that. And if it's about reputation, then it's going to be got to be about reputation, and you got to like figure out exactly what it means to be talking about reputation in the context of one particular conflict rather than previous behavior in other domains or fights, which is how we often think about reputation. If it's about private information, like whatever it is, it has to be about that. If it's about a methods contribution from this estimator, then it has to be about like the utility of that as opposed to previous approaches. Right now, it's doing all of those things, and that's I think it just needs to be like a little more cohesive in the framing.
Casey, do you have any further thoughts, or?
No, I think I just pretty much agree with everything Jonathan just said there.
Let's see. Is the queue open? Does anybody have any additional thoughts?
One last thing was to the extent that you end up pitching it around the substantive results, which is also another way of going. So like the notion that democracies are just like, that's a really interesting substantive finding, and that could also be the hook for a paper. That actually does coincide with some experiments that I've done with Josh and Karen, where we find that among a sample of Israeli Knesset members, they do see democracies as relatively disadvantaged in terms of like reputation for resolve compared to otherwise similar autocratic countries. And we found that across a bunch of different studies. So I wasn't super surprised to see that, but it's awesome to see it with this totally different approach. So if you do a substantive hook, that's another way of like pinning it to something that's already out there.
And while we're discussing, oh, I'm sorry, there was a two finger. Who was that? Ben?
Yeah, that was me, but go ahead. I'll just go after.
Okay. Just one quick thing is that when you talked about how, similar estimates of resolve are going to lead to longer conflicts, right? This put me in mind of that Powell paper about brinkmanship in 2003 in international security, where they talk about estimates of resolve as a critical risk. And you start to get escalation and costlier conflicts when your guesses about each of your breaking points are roughly similar, right? So just as kind of another, again, for me to keep saying I read this as more about, kind of getting at conjectures about two-sided uncertainty that we're usually pretty bad at. It's another good place to go. But sorry, Ben, that was you.
No, just building on Jonathan's point about the substantive side, if that's the direction you want the paper to move in, and to me, that's sort of an appealing approach, but that's just my own personal baggage. I think what might be really helpful is spending some more time thinking through the kinds of variables that you're including, because right now it's just sort of a list of the common things that are in every Civil War model. But for what you're doing, it's not clear that all of those are necessarily all that related to ideas about intransigence and reputations for resolve. And so, especially when you're parameterizing beliefs, you just sort of pick democracy and GDP, but never really give me any sense of why those two and not something else. And so, related to that, there's not a lot of data in the paper right now about rebel organizations themselves, right? And we know there's been this proliferation over the last 5 or 6 years focusing on the internal structure of rebel organizations and their access to resources and foreign support and just sort of loads and loads of other things that are probably going to give you even better ways at empirically modeling their beliefs. And so, that would be, if you want to build up the back end of the paper more, that would be a really good and relatively straightforward way to do it, is spend a little more time thinking about how you want to specify the things that go into predicting beliefs from an observed standpoint.
Who's next?
Can I do a 2-finger then a 1-finger?
Please do.
Okay, so my brief 2-finger on some of the data and the variables that are included. I think that you specify the variables that are in the model, but I think you need to choose why you're operationalizing them the way that you do. So why are you using polity versus other democracy measures? I think you might get some pushback on polity, particularly when we're talking about maybe low-level armed conflict, right? The whole more murder in the middle stuff. So I think a justification of why you're using the measures that you are would be really important, and why you're including those. But I think that's already been covered. My 1-finger follow-up is more about your presentation, your results, and the context around them. So frequently you refer to different figures as the longest wars or the predicted length, but some of these predicted lengths are actually pretty short for civil wars, particularly the slide that you presented on the duration results with just the kind of just the slice of the Z's with the these are relatively short wars, particularly for civil wars. So you're talking about kind of duration and the length of conflict, but 1 or 2 years is not very long when we're talking about conflict. So I think maybe contextualizing these a little bit, or at least explaining why this predicted duration is actually pretty short when we're talking about armed conflict, might be useful.
Casey, do you want to respond, or should we move to the next comment?
I mean, the only thing I would say to that is, the figures show that these 1 to 2 year durations, and that's mostly just a function of the average profile used to produce them. I'm sure focusing on more actually specific conflicts would produce actual profiles from specific conflicts would produce figures that would have more probably interesting durations in them. But yeah, that's all. I mean, that's a good point that you brought up.
Okay, Jonathan, I think you were next.
Well, if we're on the results section, so there are a couple things. So when the results section reads a little bit like it's still set up as sort of like the journal entry of what you did, rather than framed around like a coherent set of interesting results that are theoretically motivated in some way. So just as an example, I mean, some of these are a little funny, but the fact that there's literally a section called additional results, like expanding Z is a section head. Those are not I think taking a step back and organizing it around what you think of as the most theoretically interesting results. Like here's what we know about the reputations of these 2 different groups, and now here's the effects on conflict. Or you can even do it around like real science style, where the section headings are like the actual findings or something. But something so that right now it just reads this as sort of like, it's hard to tell what's important and what's not in the results because there's so much in there. I think probably some pruning will help, but also organizing it a tiny bit differently might help. I would also say that in this section, one thing that was missing in this paper, and I think this is probably where you put it, is there's no real consideration of concerns that readers might have about the results. I mean, like every once in a while you'll mention that something's in an appendix, but I'd like you to think about like, what would be the biggest threat to the inferences you're making? Like, what are the things that you could have gotten wrong? And can you show us why we shouldn't worry about those? What if what if the data generating process is different? Is there any way of checking for that? What if the data set that you used is having a big effect? So you're using polity too. What if you use something different? What about as the assumptions change in the formal model? What about as the statistical models change? All of these sort of quite common things. You want to preempt all the easy things, I think, if you can. And I think it should be easy to do that, but there has to be some section where you do that explicitly.
Just a two-finger on that. You just as a, for instance, one of the times when this comes up is when you say that you're basically employing an exponential hazard rate for both the government and the rebels. And there's just sort of one line saying this is pretty standard in the formal modeling literature. But in event history literature, it's actually not, right? Because what you're assuming is, the risk that the underlying risk that the government or the rebels are going to win a military victory is completely constant and unchanged over time for the entire duration. And I think when you get to, the robustness check where you show your model's results and predicted performance compared to both a Weibull model and a Cox model, and what you find is your model performs about as well, a little bit better, sometimes a little bit worse. Maybe one of the reasons why you're not doing much, much better is precisely because you're making this sort of unrealistic assumption about the underlying hazard rate being flat over time. And so, I'm not an expert on the formal model. I just wonder, is it possible to include a Weibull distribution instead to parameterize things a little bit more realistically, right? I mean, Weibull has its downsides too, but you're at least assuming the hazard rate is going up or down over time as opposed to just remaining completely flat.
Yeah, so I mean, the obvious trade-off there is whether or not these the Weibull, it has the disadvantage of not being the equilibrium strategy, and so the nature of the enterprise then is to write the empirical model to directly follow from an equilibrium, and so I agree with you that the exponential is let's call it a very distasteful assumption or result. I guess it's not it's the equilibrium result, but it would be nice if if the model fit section where could say that this is a slam dunk better approach, but that's why this is a substantive paper and not a methods paper, because the fact is we're not doing any additional harm to the data by employing this approach, but we are getting this benefit of being able to talk about reputation. And so I have no sort of illusions about saying that everyone who's studying duration should be using this. You should be using this if you want to talk about reputation, and in particular to back something out about it. And so I see sort of I understand the point about the constant hazard rates is weird from the empirical side of things, and I agree with that entirely. And to sort of join in some of these comments, I think the model fit section could be either discussed more in the main paper, or to address some of these threats to inference, or just expand in other ways. I think that's absolutely right. So thank you. If anyone has any suggestions on model fitness tests that they'd like to see, I of course would be welcoming.
Okay, we are still in the let's see, in the empirics and results discussion. Do we have any further questions? Yeah, Jonathan.
A couple. These are minor, so you don't even have to respond to them if you want. They're just some things I noted. So one of them was, there's a sentence that says, in terms of size, governments believe that roughly 1 in 8 rebel movements are intransigent. An eighth is a large proportion, given that rebels are usually thought of as relatively weak actors that lack the capability to be truly intransigent. So there it seemed like there was maybe some slippage between whether or not someone was an intransigent type and their capabilities. And I sort of thought they were being set up as orthogonal, but if they're not, then that's something to flag. And then in general, so I think, again, like these are easy fixes, but for people who are not formally inclined, the figures where you have the like Z and G, like just label it what it is. Label it like what the actual thing is rather than the parameter from the model. Because that model so well, it's very obvious to you, but if people are casually or even closely reading it, you don't want them to have to go back and look to see what your interesting results are. You want that to be like super clear. In fact, figures should almost sort of be able to be interpreted without even reading the page. You should be able to just look at the figure and know what happened.
Okay, then I think, Casey, unless you have a response, we'll go to Jackie next.
Yeah, go ahead, Jackie.
Yeah, all you, Jackie.
Okay. These are minor things, but ones I worry you're going to get pushback from reviewers because they're things I've seen from reviewers. So one is in some of the results sections, you talk about, or you imply that actors are not rational. And I think you're just using this interchangeably with one of your types. I would just avoid that. I think you're going to get unnecessary criticism. And I get what you're saying, but I worry that is too much of a loaded term for potential audiences. And then my other just minor comment is about how you're framing the Abreu and Gould model and how you're using it. Because right now it reads like, you're presenting a simplified model, but it's not clear how, to me, it's not clear how you're using it. Are you applying it in a different way than they have applied it? Is this just a straight simplified version? Are you modifying it? I think just being a little bit more upfront about what you're asking that model to do. What is the setup? What is the purpose of it? And, if this is really just you're using their results and presenting them exactly how it is, I don't know that you necessarily need to reproduce it there, but if you're applying it to a new context, which I think is what you're doing, I would just make that clear. Why is the context that you're applying it to different than what they've done? So maybe just fleshing out that setup a little bit more would help.
Okay, and it looks like Jonathan has a two-finger.
Yeah, just another vote in favor of what Jacqueline was saying. I've had two papers with formal models in them, one with Dustin Tingley and one with Alan Defoe. And both times they get like more and more farther and farther back in the paper, and eventually they've ended up in the appendix. And I think that's helped the paper generally because oftentimes they were not particularly interesting models. They were like, the interesting thing was something else in the paper, and putting the model in there when it wasn't the novel contribution itself ended up distracting from a lot of stuff. So people who have more experience with this can probably suggest when it's appropriate to have the full model out, but it's totally fine in some cases to just have the intuitions and take us through the intuitions of the model and then move forward, from my perspective at least.
Okay, and I think that Ben will, given our time, Ben, you'll get the last word, the last one finger.
Okay. This was just one final point about the empirics and the data. And in particular, it's with respect to how you go about coding the outcomes. So when does the government win? When do the rebels win? I've spent a bunch of time messing around in the UCDP termination data set trying to make sense of what the different outcomes mean. And one big one that I think reviewers are definitely going to flag is your coding of inactivity. So for you, inactivity, let me see if I have it in here. You're coding this as the rebel group backing down from the conflicts. You're treating that as a government victory. That seems at least likely to garner some pushback. So, and especially because those are really, really frequent. I think something like 30 to 35% of all outcomes in the UCDP data set are inactivity, where, my understanding of what inactivity is just the conflict falling below 25 battle deaths per year, right? So if you've got these long-running, low-intensity conflicts, in one year where you get 20 battle deaths rather than 25, it drops into inactivity and then it pops up as a new episode later on. And so, you might want to consider just as a robustness check, specifying that as a censored outcome rather than a government victory. Because I think in some cases, it might be that the government just sort of forces the rebels to back down with no formal secession. But in other cases, it's just, the Civil War is still going, the rebel group hasn't backed down. It's just, random noise in the data, basically. So you might want to, think about both justifying that a little bit more and running some robustness checks around that.
Okay, so at this point, I think what we'd like to do is see if anybody has any final thoughts, final parting shots, if you will, and then we'll let Casey have, 3, 4, 5 minutes, something like that, to give a summation of your response, and then we'll wrap up. So any final thoughts from the panel? No? Okay. Casey, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, thanks, Scott, and thanks for everyone for all for listening and for all the comments and the feedback. I do think that this has been very helpful, particularly in terms of where to go with the framing, because this has sort of been something that I've been struggling, and as you can probably tell just on which paragraph you're on in the paper, this framing's changed 4 or 5 times, and not always consistently. But yeah, no, I do think of this as a substantive paper, and I do think that that's where this should go. And I think that the remarks that you give me about whether or not to think of this as reputation or sort of some ways to specify sort of which things previous work has gotten right regarding, like, say, the democracy result. All of this is sort of really, I think, solidified where I think I want to take this paper, and thankfully, it's in the direction that I was hoping it would go in. So that's always good when that happens. But overall, I really just want to say thank you for all the feedback. It's been incredibly helpful, and I'm just delighted to have this opportunity. Thank you.
Great. And as we wrap up, thank you, Casey, for presenting a great paper. I know I learned a lot from it. Thanks to our panelists and Peter for helping run the show behind the scenes. If you are joining, well, if you're watching this and you're curious about the paper, you can find it on the OPSC Colloquium website, which you can also get to through the Peace Science Society website. This will be archived on YouTube, so whatever mistakes we've made will be there forever. You can go back, see them, and enjoy the presentation again if you want. You can also comment on the YouTube page if you like. And with that, I would simply encourage you to tune back in a week from today, same bat time, same bat channel, for a paper by Shanna Kirshner and Adam Miller on peacekeeping and whether it really brings peace. And otherwise, thanks a bunch, everyone, and we'll see you next week.